Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Peggy O'Neill. I'm the adult programming librarian at Penfield Public Library, and we're delighted this evening to have our special program on racist policy and resistance in Rochester. I'm going to give a little background on Shane Wiegand, who is our speaker this evening. Shane is a fourth grade teacher in the Rush-Henrietta School District and the co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. Shane has researched, compiled, and taught Rochester's history of structural racism and resistance in his classroom for the past 8 years. Starting with several fourth grade teachers in his school district, Shane has now trained over 900 teachers in anti-racist curriculum across multiple school districts. He is also a board member of Connected Communities, the Beechwood Neighborhood Coalition, the Police Accountability Board Alliance, and City Roots Community Land Trust. He is an adjunct faculty instructor in the U of R MC Department of Neurology. He and his wife live in the Beechwood neighborhood of Rochester. And tonight's talk will be examining how federal and local policies like redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and urban renewal segregated Greater Rochester and exclusionary zoning in towns like Penfield built wealth for its white citizens and disenfranchised people of color. It explores how local civil rights leaders, Dr. Charles Lunsford, Howard Coles, Dr. Walter Cooper, Connie Mitchell, Alice Young, and many others fought back. Finally, it connects these past policies to the disparity and inequality we see in Rochester today and invites us to learn from and apply the activism of Rochester's past to its present. Just a couple housekeeping rules. If people would keep themselves muted and then put any questions or comments you have in the chat. And so without further, and also the program is being recorded, so you could catch it after if you like, probably in about a week on the Penfield Rec YouTube channel. So without further ado, Shane, it's all yours.
I want to thank Peggy and the Penfield Library for hosting me. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm super excited to share some of the research that I've done and the stories I've gotten to hear from many of my friends who have been civil rights leaders of the past and present here in our community. And largely, I just want to impart a message of hope today, that if we look at the uncomfortable and difficult history of our community and have the courage to really look at it, to own it, we might be able to dismantle some of the racism that remains in our community and move forward in building one that's more just and equitable. On the left, you see the redlining map of Rochester from 1935, a racist policy from the federal government. We'll talk about at length today. On the right, you'll see the Reverend Gibson, what may have been the first protest for justice against racism in the Rochester Police Department. 1962, a man named Rufus Farewell was brutally beaten in police custody for the crime of being Black and locking up the gas station that he owned. Men like Gus Newport, Dr. Cooper, and others fought to get him justice, and hundreds protest on the steps of City Hall as well to get justice. But more on that story and the many others, and the direct link from some of these racist housing policies and housing from the past, many of which still exist in the present, to the current moment of unrest and how do we move forward. A quick note on the co-lead with Keisha James of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. We're generously hosted by the Pathstone Foundation, and we've developed curriculum at grades 4, 8, and 12 that's specific to the local history of racist policy and civil rights in Monroe County. And we've trained almost 450 teachers since July in how to teach this story to their students in a way that helps students draw their own conclusions, critically examine primary source documents from the towns they live in, and learn about the people who fought for justice in our community and against, and learn how to have these conversations in safe, supportive ways through things like restorative practices and group norms and a whole host of other amazing things that our incredible team has used their insight, their experience, and their talent to come together and to create. And we're really excited to have had the chance to partner this last year and train a number of teachers in the Penfield School District. And I know many of those teachers are teaching this right now. And I'm so excited to hear how that goes. And it's been a real pleasure and honor to work with the amazing district you have in Penfield. A few notes about the sources I'm going to touch on. Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. He came to Rochester. I got to pick him up from the airport. He actually went through all these slides and gave a lot of great insight into how to tell the national story that he tells about redlining and racist housing for Rochester. You'll see a ton from the Democrat and Chronicles archives, the New York State Commission on Discrimination, the Rochester Voices Oral History Project is part of the Rochester Public Library, and a ton of interviews that I've had the chance to do with folks in our community who you'll see in this presentation. I do want to give you a quick warning. I am going to talk fast. I'm going to cover a lot of our community's history. I know some of you will love it. I'm talking fast. Some of you will say, oh my gosh, he's talking way too quick. I please just hope that you'll accept my apologies. I will share at the end a link to these slides, all of the sources, as well as several different recordings of this presentation, including one with me and Simeon Bannister that goes into a little more detail about the solutions. A quick note before we move forward. There's this incredible quote from Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. And it frames a lot of the work that I want to do today. Because for me, for most of my life, growing up in Webster, right on the borderline there, Penfield, off Plank Road, I would have defined myself as not racist. But Ibram Kendi would have said, actually, I think you might be a racist, Shane. And this is why. He says there's a problem with this term, not racist. It's a claim that signifies neutrality. I'm not racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. There's no neutrality in the racism struggle. One either allows racial inequities to persevere, which I really think is what I did for most of my life, just allowing it, doing nothing, complicity as a racist, or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There's not an in-between or a safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is often a mask for racism. And I want to invite us to consider that when you hear me use a term like racist, I want you to think of that as something that is an action or an inaction that creates racial inequality. Whereas when you hear me say anti-racist, and you'll see many of those in here, I want you to think of someone who is actively fighting for justice and to end racial inequality, who believes all people are equal. And I hope that's an interesting sort of framing. I know for me, there was some cognitive dissonance and discomfort when I first read this quote, but I think it takes a lot of the intention out of it. It's not about our intention, it's about the outcome and impact of our thoughts, words, deeds, or lack of action. Because in our community, both action and inaction has led to significant issues when it comes to racial disparity and injustice, beginning with slavery in upstate New York, which was a part of our community. In fact, right here in Penfield, just down the street from the library on Main Street, the house of Daniel Penfield still stands. He kept several enslaved African people behind that house. Other enslavers in our community, like Rochester, brought 13 enslaved people with him, used the sale of several enslaved Africans to buy what is today Rochester. Towns like Henrietta, Gates, Mount Morris, all named for enslavers. But of course, people in our community came together and fought back, like we'll have to do today. The great Frederick Douglass, challenging slavery, or Austin Stewart, who was enslaved in Stoughton, New York, escaped to Rochester, opening the first Black-owned business, school for Black children, and a spot on the Underground Railroad. He tirelessly spoke out about the evil that was happening in our community with enslavement and eventually was victorious, getting to speak on the day of emancipation in New York State with the governor. And he wrote an incredible book that you can read online about his experience in slavery in New York State and his fight back against it. Of course, great suffragists were known for folks like Susan B. Anthony, who took action to create change and fight for equity. We're a town of innovation that changed the way we see the world. But some of these folks, like George Eastman's legacies, are a little more complicated than we've always talked about, as you'll see later. Because the thing is, today, we're going to have to come together. We're going to have to name racism for what it is. We're going to have to innovate. We're going to have to collaborate with folks from all different backgrounds and perspectives. And we're going to have to innovate if we're going to put a dent in the significant issues related to racial disparity in our community. The 2020 Hard Facts Report found that in our region, Black children are more than 4 times as likely than white children to live in poverty. Let that statistic sink in. 4 times as likely. Both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts. half as likely. And when you look at this map of Rochester, where the majority of home ownership is in our suburbs, as are the majority of white folks, and the majority of Black and Hispanic folks live in our crescent or inner city of Rochester, previously redlined neighborhoods, we look at this map and we can't say this just happened by accident. In fact, it was segregation by design that led to things like Penfield being the #1 most segregated school district in the country. Its border between Rochester and Penfield is #1 in the country for most segregated by race and class. Brighton is #6. West Irondequoit is #7. Our schools in New York State, our state, is #1 in the country for most segregated, more than Mississippi, more than Florida, more than Alabama, New York State, and of course, Ed Build tells us that Rochester and Penfield is #1. And this segregation has significant effects. In fact, a child from Pittsburgh's majority white zip code born today will live up to 9 years longer than a child in Rochester's previously redlined 14608 zip code. White privilege literally being life itself. The wealth gap in our country is significant, with white families having 10 times the net worth of Black, a gap that only continues to widen over time. So what can we do? This is the thesis of my talk today. The words of the great James Baldwin, who writes, "Not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I hope you'll join me in that incredible statement of hope and courage in facing some of the root causes of racial disparity in our community, that we might dismantle it and move forward in creating a more just and equitable Rochester for all. Like Howard Coles dared to do back in 1938 as editor of the Black newspaper The Voice on Clarissa Street, calling out the federal policy of redlining and segregation. In his paper, he documents how banks and real estate agents forced Black folks to live in just 2 neighborhoods, how theaters like Eastman and Lyndhurst wouldn't allow Black folks to attend shows at those theaters because of the color of their skin, calling out the lack of police that were Black. In fact, there were no Black police officers. Howard Coles called that out until Chuck Price was elected. And then he did a massive study of all Black homes in Monroe County, finding almost all of them were in 2 neighborhoods, the 3rd and 7th Ward, where over 30% of those homes did not have running water because of what was happening with their white landlords. The Dr. Anthony Jordan built on that legacy from Coles, on his good friend's work, and found that, in fact, in these 2 neighborhoods and with people of color, the death rate for people of color was 50% higher of all causes than whites. And when it came to tuberculosis, the death rates were 2.5 times that of whites in Rochester. And the headline in the paper that day when he published this data was "Poor Housing Linked to High Black Tuberculosis Rates." Of course, great physicians like Dr. Lunsford, our region's first Black doctor. He also played host to Dr. Martin Luther King when King came to Rochester to fight housing segregation and police brutality. Well, Dr. Lunsford in the early 1930s fought against the University of Rochester, who refused to admit Black students in its nursing and medical programs. He fought hard for over 10 years with the NAACP, eventually getting New York State to threaten to take away U of R's tax-exempt status if they wouldn't allow a Black student in. U of R conceded and allowed 1 student of color in each year. The very famous Dean Whipple was the man in the way, though, who fought hard to keep those Black students out, proudly admitting even in a New York State commission in 1939 that he wouldn't allow Black students into his medical program because they'd have to examine white women during their obstetric rounds, and that just wouldn't do in this community. Sounds like Mississippi, it was Rochester. Then in 1956, this legacy of people facing and calling out this racism head on, the Reverend Body and Mount Olivet, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available for him. If any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempts are met with opposition. And the specific opposition that we're going to explore together tonight and face head on is racism in the code of ethics of the real estate industry, racially restrictive covenants, a redlining in the VA and FHA-backed loans from the 1934 National Housing Act. We're going to talk about urban renewal, displacement, exclusionary zoning, and education, and how we might move forward. A note about the period of time, 1910 to 1970, the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans fled the South to the North in search of better jobs, fleeing white domestic terrorism from the citizen councils and clans, coming to places like Rochester. It's interesting to note A significant part of our Black population hails from Sanford, Florida, a fruit picking area, and they didn't come to Rochester to work at Kodak, where they weren't allowed, at least until the late 50s and 60s, but instead to pick fruit in Rochester's suburbs and rural areas in towns like Penfield. Now, when those folks got here, they had a really hard time finding somewhere to live. And it was because in Rochester, starting around 1910 up until 1956 or so, the real estate board would take away your real estate license if you broke its code of ethics. And one of the most prominent rules in their code, enforced by local president Frank Drum, was that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property, occupancy, or members of any race, nationality, or individuals whose presence will be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. These real estate men ruled with an iron fist. Howard Coles, who you just met of the Voice newspaper, got his real estate license, showed people of color homes in white neighborhoods like the 19th Ward or towns like Penfield, and was quickly forced out of the real estate industry for daring to stare down this code of ethics. And these men were incredibly successful. Dr. Walter Cooper, finishing up his chemistry PhD at U of R as the first PhD in chemistry of color in University of Rochester, describes how even though his upper middle class status, he says, I confronted housing segregation in Rochester. It was 1954. The wife and I answered ads for 69 apartments, and we were refused at all of them. Dr. Alice Holloway Young, she was a star teacher, one of the founders of Monroe Community College, eventually the first Black principal in all of Monroe County. She just won a New York State Liberty Medal, if you might have seen her in the news recently. She's a friend of mine and an incredible hero in the civil rights movement in Rochester, but someone who I never heard about until 5 or 6 years ago when I had the chance to meet and hear her story. And Dr. Young and her husband in 1957 wanted to buy a house in the 19th Ward. They wanted to move out of the redlined 3rd Ward and have a little more yard space for their kids. But not a single bank or real estate agent would let them be pre-approved or shown a home in the neighborhood, despite several homes being for sale, and despite the Youngs being an upper middle class family that really should have been able to afford to live anywhere in Monroe County. The Youngs reached out to their friend Harper Sibley of the NAACP. This was a straw man practice, quite common at the time. Harper Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph fortune bought her a house sight unseen on Millbank Street, lied on the paperwork, and deeded the home back over to Alice and her husband, James, saying that Alice was her niece. Clearly, Alice was not her niece. The Youngs moved in the middle of the night because they were afraid of white domestic terrorism from the Klan in Rochester. And sure enough, the next morning, they received threats to have their house burned down, racial epithets signed by the Ku Klux Klan of Millbank Street. But the Youngs refused to leave. And Alice has asked that when I share her story, I mention the Bushes, the one white family on the street that knew this was wrong and stood up for the Youngs, helping them live there for the next 17 years as allies in their fight for integration and just the right to live where they chose. And the next time someone says to you, oh, that was just the times, remember Alice and her friend, the Bushes, who knew this was wrong, stood against it, and ushered in some significant changes in our community. We don't think of our town, though, as a Klan town, but look at the front page of the D&C in 1926. Over 8,000 robed and hooded Klansmen burning 3 50-foot-high crosses in what is today East Rochester High School's football field. This is right next door to Penfield. 1910 to 48. Restrictive covenants. This is the next area of opposition or racist policy that Black folks faced in trying to find a place to live, to build wealth, or have just equal access to opportunity in our community. These covenants continue to shape Monroe County, although are no longer legally enforceable. In the South, you all know that the famous signs in front of water fountains and bathrooms and train cars, like whites only. Well, those signs were just as prominent in Monroe County, just not in bathrooms, not at train stations, but on deeds. Something that was public. Anyone can go to the county clerk's office and look at anyone's deed in town. In fact, it's quite a bit of fun. And I've spent hundreds of hours going through the deeds in the microfilm at the county clerk's office. And my friends and I, my students, and our partners at City Roots and Yale Environmental Law School's Protection Clinic have found hundreds and actually tens of thousands of these covenants in Monroe County, including Penfield, explicitly saying these homes shall never be occupied by persons not of the Caucasian race. And this wasn't something that a few fringe racists did. These were the elected officials of Monroe County, the head of the builders, the Wegmans family, school districts. This was a part of Monroe County's social structure and its elite. It's educated, not it's ignorant. It's folks who intentionally did this to amass power. Like County Manager Clarence Smith, who in 39 and 40, he and the entire legislature voted to approve racial covenants being put on all county tax foreclosed properties, like on these streets in Irondequoit, where he explicitly signed on to this language that no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy these buildings or lots. Caucasian in 1939 meant Anglo-Saxon, right? It did not mean Italian, it did not mean Jewish, and it most certainly did not mean Black, Latino, or Asian. All of those folks would have been excluded from these thousands of homes in Monroe County. And right there is that a perfect example of de jure segregation by our local government. But our biggest businesses in town contributed too. Take the Meadowbrook neighborhood, right by the high school in Brighton, almost 371 homes. They describe themselves on their website as carefully planned development. And it was so carefully planned that when Eastman Kodak bought this land, founded ESL Bank to finance these buildings and these mortgages, Vice President of Kodak, Harry Haight, put onto every single deed the clause that no dwelling should ever be sold to or occupied by a Black person. Explicit right there, done by Kodak, financed by ESNL, a neighborhood that is today less than 6% African American. Kodak at the time actually did not hire people of color. They had one Black janitor out of 16,000 employees. Bausch and Lomb had 0 Black employees. And this was all written up in the 1939 New York State Commission on the Urban Population. And it really speaks to some of the culture going on in our community. The Democrat and Chronicle, though, was active as well in supporting, enforcing, or not enforcing, but making it the norm, this white supremacy in people's deeds, advertising and writing up the need to have racial covenants on homes, like at Council Rock Estates in Brighton, where the DNC advertised these were great buys because of their rigid restrictions for desirable social character. And there are the deeds to the homes in Council Rock. Schools like Gates School District put these underneath school buildings, explicitly saying no lot shall be used or occupied by any members of the Caucasian race. Segregated schools right here in Monroe County, written in black and white to the deeds, and signed right here, Chesterfield and his friends, they were the school board who put this into the covenants. The Catholic Church, the Bishop John Francis O'Hearn, putting these covenants underneath Catholic churches like St. James Church over on the east side, or all along the homes of East Avenue Estates by Oak Hill Country Club, Fair Acres in Fairport, Forest Hills in East Rochester, Parrington, over 2,000 in Irondequoit, over by the zoo in Somerville, Rogers Estates, one of which was bought by Walter Wegman, the Walter Wegman who founded the food markets that many of us shop at today, got some of his wealth through home ownership, whites only home ownership that he agreed to. And when he sold his home, made sure that even though it had been expired, it was re-upped and the racial covenant kept on the deed to his home. Webster, notice Polish and Italian along with Black folks are being excluded from those homes. Dayton Corners in Penfield, Penfield Manor, this is right by the little schoolhouse there. Ellison Park Heights is another one of those neighborhoods. Notice the advertisement for Ellison Park Heights. It's pretty clear who's allowed to live there, but the deed makes it even more explicit. All throughout Greece, Dewey Stone, Denise Road, Marwood, Latona Homesteads, the head of the Builders Association, hundreds of these homes and gates with his friend Frank Drum, the head of the real estate board, putting on these covenants. The head of the bar, Early F. Case, also put these racial covenants on hundreds of homes. This wasn't a small fringe. It was the heads of the real estate, business, and local government and building community in Rochester that was collaborating on this effort to keep Rochester's white neighborhoods and suburbs white. But of course, people of color fought back. as they always have, from Austin Stewart to Frederick Douglass to Howard Coles to Judge Reuben Davis, who dared to buy a home in the 19th Ward. He says in his oral history at the Rochester Public Library, "My wife and I were looking for a house. It was 1958. We saw one on 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester, just a block or so west of Genesee. I'd say there were probably 4 Black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee Street at that time. The owner refused to sell to us because we were Black. And there was a covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or, to Italians." Quick note, Italians, Polish, Jewish folks before 1944 were deemed non-Caucasian. But when the GI Bill passed in 1944, those folks legally became white and had access to home ownership. Not that they didn't face discrimination, but they no longer were facing that same discrimination from the federal government and had access to VA and FHA mortgages, where veterans of World War II, like Judge Davis, did not have that same access to home ownership and wealth through FHA or VA loans, despite having fought for their country. There's his home, 135 Elmdorf, the year that he bought it. Notice Nothnagel is selling this home and enforcing the racial covenant. He writes, though, "I was active in the NAACP at the time, and a white friend bought the house and transferred it to me. We had to go through those kinds of devious methods in order to find housing," describing his situation as quite typical for himself and for other people of color, no matter their means, for finding good, safe housing where they chose. Now, if you look at the map that we're slowly building with the students at Yale and some friends at RIT and U of R and my students, you'll see covenants all across the community. Those Black spaces represent all white neighborhoods that have covenants on every home. Pretty much every suburb and the city of Rochester have these. We found about 10 to 20,000 and estimate another 10 to 20,000 covenants are yet to be found. But what's interesting is these covenants start in Rochester around 1900, 1910, and are forcibly put into place up until the very early 1950s. But in the 1930s, they were actually, they were codified in the federal government's housing policy. It's the wake of the Great Depression. FDR, not from Mississippi, from New York State, signs into law as part of the New Deal, the National Housing Act of 1934. This law builds the town of Penfield, Webster, Pittsford, Greece. It subsidizes the construction of over 35 million families' homes, $119 billion in federal mortgage insurance. It invents the FHA 30-year mortgage with very little money down and a fixed interest rate. And the VA and GI Bill adopts everything from this policy and continues to dole this out. And between 1934 and 1968, this builds our nation's suburbs. And written explicitly into this policy, it said, if the neighborhood is to retain stability, its necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy leads to instability and a reduction in values. A racist policy justified by an untrue and racist idea. Going even farther, codifying those covenants, explicitly saying deed restrictions should be imposed on all land if you want federal subsidies. So big builders had to make sure that if they were going to get federal subsidies to buy materials up front or have their lots insured, they must put on every deed prohibitions of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they're intended. Going even farther to mandate school segregation and using highways to separate inharmonious racial groups. Yesterday, I had the chance to be on 1370 Connections with Evan Dawson and my friend Mary Kearney, who describes how the inner loop destroyed her predominantly Black neighborhood and the southeastern loop on Savannah Street for urban renewal. Part of enforcing this policy of using highways to separate white and Black areas. Now, there's cognitive dissonance that goes on here because the way I was raised and taught in Webster schools is that racism's in the South, and it's mostly ignorant people, right? Uneducated. That's really the problem. But Ibram Kendi, in thinking about someone like FDR, he says, here's another way to think about it. Time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era. like this policy, this law. In the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, the author writes, the ultimate goal of racism was the profit and comfort of the white race, specifically rich white men, of which I'd include myself, my father, and both of my grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers in the 50s and 60s received FHA mortgages, 30-year loans, very little money down, insured and subsidized by the government. Those government handouts allowed them to buy homes in suburbs like my grandpa's home in Greece, where his home quadrupled in value, and equity he used to send my mom to college, to invest in his dental practice, to help send me to college, right? When I made the stupid mistake my first year of teaching, I had no money, I crashed my car on the way to work, couldn't afford it, of course, to fix it. What happens? My family has generational wealth. It's just a stupid mistake. My family's there to help me out and send that big check so that I can get to work the next day. Whereas for someone without generational wealth, that stupid mistake starts to become a tragedy, right? This generational wealth in our country has been built by home ownership. We know home ownership and wealth are directly tied in America, but home ownership became the norm, at least for white folks, because of this racist housing policy tied to the federal government. And the way it was enforced was through something called redlining, a term many of you might have heard. They called it residential security at the time. And it was residential security from people who were Black or people who were lower class. Neighborhoods were rated by color. The Homeowners Loan Corporation went street by street, house by house, rating based on these key factors as dictated in the policy I just read. Green and blue being best because they were 100% white, middle and upper middle class. Blue or yellow meaning declining, maybe poor white folks in those neighborhoods, older homes. Red meaning hazardous, if even one person of color lived in those neighborhoods. Notice where in the city those redlined or hazardous neighborhoods are. The 7th Ward here in the north, that Joseph, Hudson, Clinton area of the city. Down here, Clarissa Street, Plymouth Exchange. This neighborhood today is where children are expected to live 9 years less than over here in Pittsford, a blue line neighborhood. Let's take a look though at Cornhill. 75% Black, the government said, 10% foreign. Italian was part of what they perceived as a hazard, and incomes of below $1,500 a year. So hazardous rating. Compare it to Pittsford, 0% Black, 0% foreign, quadruple the income. Therefore, if you're white, you can get a 30-year mortgage to buy a home and move into these neighborhoods by Oak Hill. Compare my neighborhood in the city of Rochester. I live in Beechwood, 2% Black at the time, 30% foreign, deemed hazardous. Beechwood is today over 75% Black. It was designed that way in the 30s by the federal government. Compare it to Meadowbrook in Brighton, built by Kodak. Almost 20 years after its construction, it's still 0% Black. Those deeds are holding true that you saw earlier. And it's businessmen, white collar, and also significant incomes. Take a look at some of these areas that I guess are technically Brighton, but are part of Penfield schools, like over on Ellison Park Heights. You can see 0% Black, 0% foreign, white collar, incomes of up to $10,000, executives. Meanwhile, all of the suburbs were green lined. The neighborhoods that weren't as populated in the suburbs, they didn't get colors. They were just deemed, if you're white, you can move there with federal subsidies. And these policies were so effective that in Rochester, our most integrated suburb was Henrietta in 1960 with just 11 individual people of color, led by Dr. Walter Cooper, who originally tried to move to Penfield. But racial covenants, banks, and real estate agents continued to deny him. Even though he was a senior scientist at Kodak, as was his wife, PhD, he couldn't buy a home in Penfield where he originally tried. So he and his friends at the NAACP moved into Henrietta, not because they wanted to, but because, I quote, there was nowhere else to go. Dr. Cooper now lives in Penfield. He refused to let that racism stop him. He's 92. He's a good friend of mine on the advisory board of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project and continues to fight against racial discrimination in our community and in our country, carrying on the legacy of what he had done in the past. Richard Rothstein gives us some more national scope and scale, saying that the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide through this explicitly racist policy, giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance to over 35 million families who benefited from these loans. 98% of them, like my family, were white. It wasn't until the end of the 60s that a few Black families were able to start to benefit until the 68 Fair Housing Act. We have to ask ourselves, though, it's the town of Frederick Douglass, right? Susan B. Anthony. This couldn't have been something Rochester truly welcomed. It must have been a few bad apples. But what was going on in almost every school in Monroe County, Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, Grange Hall, Catholic and Protestant church, spoke to the welcome that Black people received, like Dr. Cooper, when in 1960 he looked at towns like Penfield to buy a house, faced. Something called blackface minstrel shows, incredibly popular and publicized in all of the local papers. These are hard to look at. 1960 here, the elementary school in Honeyway Falls. You can see the Cub Scouts on stage in blackface. Now, a blackface minstrel show always follows the same pattern. You have a group of people called N-men, Jim Crow, a Jim C-O-O-N, a dandy character, a Black Sambo, a Rastus. They sing like songs like, Showboat Review and Riverboat Blues, and like horrifically racist songs and jokes, mocking the intelligence of people of color, and even sending just messages of contempt and hate, and making it incredibly clear who is welcome in these spaces, these schools, these town halls, these clubs where these things are happening. The Penfield Fire Department had its annual blackface show at Penfield High School every year. Notice Indian Landing Elementary School, 1954, their annual blackface minstrel show right there on stage, put on by the Parent Teacher Association, using blackface to fund a white school. Kodak, GM, their executives would get together in blackface, proudly publish photographs of themselves doing this in the Kodak magazine. The Jewish Youth Association, almost every school in RCSD, the paper publishing glowing reviews of these blackface shows as a full endorsement of this white supremacy. You can see, and by white supremacy, I'm talking about the normalization of racism. You can never publish a picture like this today, but this was commonplace in the Democrat and Chronicle and all of our other local papers. Take a look at Aquinas, Brighton High School's Licorice Lights, right on its stage. Allendale Private School, in partnership with the Memorial Art Gallery at U of R, putting these shows on. The Rotary Club and High School in Webster, joining up for their blackface show. Newark, Pittsford's Catholic Church and Town Hall, teaming up to have their annual blackface show on the Town Hall stage. RIT, U of R, it was every town, and it was almost every year. And if you go into the archives, you will find these photographs and write-ups in every town almost every year, sending a very clear message of what was going on in the culture and what was welcomed in terms of who was wanted to live where. And people of color, again, like Judge Davis, like Howard Coles, like Dr. Cooper, they called this racism out. Reverend Quentin Primo, head of the NAACP, wrote to the DNC and to almost every school in the county, and one of his letters got published. He wrote, "These blackface shows must be banned from public and private schools, churches, public buildings. To do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community-accepted shows." Key phrase there, community accepted, towards all of the dark-skinned people of the world. Meanwhile, people of color continued to speak out and to fight. And instead of action, they got what we often get, what we just got, another commission about racism, instead of policy change. In 1958, Governor Harriman responded with the New York State Commission Against Discrimination, which, while not super helpful for folks at the time, gives us some specific scope and scale of how these racist policies directly impacted the Black and Latino community in Rochester, finding that 80% of all people of color lived in just two neighborhoods, the Redline 3rd and 7th wards, that more than 1,600 units in both neighborhoods had either no bathroom, a shared bathroom, or more than 2,000 units, more than one person living in each room. When there's nowhere else to go, you have incredible overcrowding. Now, I want to introduce you to one of my heroes, Constance Mitchell. You think in the town of Rochester, the town of Susan B. Anthony, every child would know the name of Constance Mitchell. I learned who she was about 6 years ago when I met her daughter. She was the first person of color, and from my understanding, the first woman to be elected to public office in Rochester. And she describes why she ran. It was to fight redlining, saying we were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house in Gregg Street, the agent told us, "I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Ave. They're not open to Black people." We were confined from Jefferson Avenue back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side, redlined part of the city. After 2 tries, she won that 7th Ward supervisor position. And my 4th grader's love in the children's book that we wrote about her life, that when she moved in that first day, what the head of the Democratic Party said to her, "Why did you let the N-word into the blank blank?" I mean, just horrific stuff. There was no women's bathroom for her to use when she joined the county legislature. It's just horrific what went on. And yet Connie fought back and created change because change needed to happen. The report found that 30% of all homes or units had no running water. There was a significant lack of public utilities like trash pickup, as you can see in this DNC photo. There was rats running rampant and biting small children. Countless stories in the DNC about that, actually. Fascinating to look at, and evictions. People like Dr. Kenneth Woodward fought back with healthcare, trying to put Band-Aids over some of these wounds that the federal government had wreaked on these 2 neighborhoods, opening a clinic at Baden Street to help people who didn't have access to healthcare, something that's continued to be needed in these neighborhoods. Meanwhile, 57 Black families who had significantly more means were able to sneak their way in to neighborhoods and buy a home outside of these redline neighborhoods, like the Wells pictured here, or the Lees, or the Coopers, or the Biases. But the report documents that these pioneers and incredibly courageous folks in Rochester faced violence and resistance. Dr. Thomas and Romina Bias moved into West Irondequoit in 1964. Because of their skin color, rocks were thrown through their living room windows. They were threatened, they sold their home, and they moved to Henrietta to live in solidarity with the Coopers and the Lees and the Wells. But sure enough, they had to sue for the right to live in that home on Gatehouse Trail because the white developer wouldn't sell to them because of the color of their skin. They won, and that was the way they moved into Henrietta. People like Dick Ricketts on our local NBA team. Took him 16 months to find an apartment. Dr. Cooper was the one that found it for him. Peter Tulliver in Brighton. Majority of his neighbors pooled their money and went to the bank before the final paperwork was signed if they heard he was buying a house on their street, and they stole the house out from under him. The Tullivers and NAACP successfully sued, and the Tullivers still live in that home today. The Stubbses in Greece. This is Ellen Stubbs, who in 1963 got creative. There's something called checkers, where you have a white and Black family of similar means and work go into a neighborhood and speak to the developer on the same day looking for homes. The white family was told there were several properties available in the development on Long Pond Road. The Stubbses were told that they were all sold out. They sued, they won, and became one of the first Black families to own a home in Greece. I wish I could say these stories are aberrations, but the New York State Commission, as does the DNC, and so many oral histories shows that this was what was happening in Rochester and was common. In fact, not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any person of color in any suburb, at least until 1958. Meanwhile, builders like the Farishes, Drums, and Hucks and Tosches were making hundreds of millions of dollars, building these whites-only suburban developments subsidized by the federal government. In a recent Pittsford Historic Resource Survey published on the town's website, Barrow Architecture acknowledges it was the federal policies of the 30s to the 50s that allowed Pittsford to jump in population from 9,000 to over 25,000 residents. What the Pittsford report fails to mention is that all of those were for white folks. These were subsidized homes. People were buying these homes for $10,000, $20,000, and today they're selling for $400,000, $500,000. And this same story is true in towns like Penfield and Webster, where it is incredibly difficult to buy a home in these neighborhoods unless you have a subsidy, which white families like mine got when they bought their home in the suburbs, but is not available for people of color today. Instead of access to home ownership, people of color faced even more barriers. In the terms of the glossy, friendly phrase urban renewal, which Black people in Rochester called Black folk removal or displacement, where leaders of the community like Elmer Milliman of Central Trust Bank, John Dale, and the folks of the city and the city council voted to approve the displacement of over 886 families from the 7th Ward, 850 from the 3rd, and in the Savannah Street neighborhood area, over 350 families, where Strong Museum sits today. All predominantly Black neighborhoods, over 60 of the families that were displaced were Black folks. And these highways and raisings of buildings went through places that, though segregated, though lacking of access to public utilities and running water, were still thriving in even integrated communities. Places like Clarissa Street over there on the left, they had thriving jazz clubs like the Python, Shep's, Black-owned businesses like Jesse Stevens Grocery. These were neighborhoods where people didn't lock their doors. They felt safe. They knew their neighbors. They looked out for each other. And the federal government, with over $35 million in subsidies, and our local leaders decided to follow through with these racist policies. And it was these neighborhoods that were raised first and those families that had the most trouble. But where could those families go? Yesterday on Evan Dawson, if you have a chance to go back and listen to that podcast, I'll share the link at the end. You can hear Mary Kearney describing losing her home on Savannah Street, where Strawn Museum is now, because of the inner loop being built. And her family, sure enough, got split apart. 3 of her uncles lived on the Savannah Street neighborhood, all in different homes, and the entire family was separated into 3 different redlined parts of the city. She ended up over on Jefferson Avenue, which where is the place today. We all know that Daniel Prude was killed while in police custody. A story that isn't a news story on Jefferson Avenue or these redline neighborhoods, where issues between police and the communities that they are containing became significant because the community had a choice. We could invest and fund housing, anti-racist housing policies. We could give access to these people who have been disenfranchised in our community by these policies. Or we could fund our police departments and we could protect in quotes, the other parts of our area through a policy of policing and containment. The police force rose in size and began to much heavier police these redline neighborhoods, leading to all kinds of significant issues, like the Fairwells. There's Rufus Fairwell sitting in a wheelchair where he was put by a white police officer who, while handcuffed, brutally beat him within an inch of his life. And on the left, the Reverend Gibson of Memorial AME fighting for justice for the Fairwells. But it wasn't just Rufus Fairwell. It was A.C. White. It was the Black Muslims. Malcolm X came to town because the police department raided the mosque in Rochester, the Black Mosque, during Mass because they were mad that they were speaking out against police brutality, or problems like the Faison case, or Denise Hawkins, Kenneth Jackson, Alicia McCullough. Story after story that tells this line in these red line neighborhoods up to a Daniel Prude, and the stories that continue to happen. Of course, the good Dr. Kenneth Woodward knew that public health had to also do with public safety, and that public safety has to do with accountability of those in charge of it. And so he helped form and sat on the police advisory board in 1963. Sadly, they were immediately defunded by the incoming administration and disbanded. And it wasn't until just a year or 2 ago that Rochester got a new police accountability board that hopefully will have the power to discipline, but currently has the power to set policy, to subpoena records, to subpoena officers, and to raise all kinds of stink to create change. And they are not fully funded right now. So one of the most important civil rights issues we can push for in our community is to push our elected leaders to fully fund our police accountability board in the city of Rochester. I strongly recommend taking a look at that great work and the work of the Police Accountability Board Alliance that helps support it. All of this, redlining, displacement, lack of running water, and police brutality, according to county historian Vaca, who went through the arrest records and census data, directly caused an uprising, rebellion, or what some have called a riot, that lasted over 3 days in this hot summer week in July 1964. If you haven't seen the documentary, I recommend that you see it. 1,000 people were arrested, 1,500 National Guard troops were called out to quell the protest and sometimes violence as people rebelled against their white elected leaders, against the police, against their white landlords and shopkeepers, and really just, they didn't know what else to do. They had peacefully protested, they had done all kinds of things, and people started to lose it. And the number one cause was people who had been pushed out of their homes were the people that got arrested. Imagine losing your home and being packed into an apartment on Jefferson Avenue. Librarian Olga Edwards, one of the first Black librarians in Monroe County, describes living on Jefferson Avenue and during urban renewal watching hundreds of Black families pack onto Jefferson Avenue as white landlords would take single-family homes and convert them into 5-family apartments with just one toilet for 5 families. I feel like I would be someone who'd be ready to take to the streets in a moment like that, much like people did in Rochester this summer. Rochester wasn't alone. Almost every redline neighborhood in the country had its own uprising, protest, rebellion, or riot. And after King's assassination, Lyndon Johnson ran through the 1968 Fair Housing Act that, while it outlawed redlining and racial covenants and allowed access to full citizenship through home ownership to Black people in our country and Latino people, it unfortunately left almost the entire onus of enforcement on the individual to submit claims and to sue those developers who were being racist against them, making it very difficult for someone who already is struggling when it comes to wealth or to income because of racism and segregation to enforce it. The other tool that the Fair Housing Act used was HUD, Housing and Urban Development, which if a community was failing to, I quote, affirmatively further fair housing, end quote, they could take away sewer or block grants. And George Romney on the left, Mitt Romney's dad, actually tried to enforce this in Michigan. Nixon got wind and fired him and ordered that this law not be enforced by the removal of funds, justifying this by saying, I'm convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong, saying, I realize this position will lead us to a situation in which Black people continue to live for the most part in Black neighborhoods and will be predominantly Black schools and predominantly white schools, like Penfield or Webster, where I grew up, or Black schools like RCSD, going against what was the law. And Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times has actually found that since President Nixon, the federal government through HUD has only removed funds because of the Fair Housing Act 2 times until President Barack Obama came into office. Meanwhile, we have school segregation, which we knew was rampant in Monroe County and across the country. But Rochester came late to the game. On the left, you'll see Elizabeth Eckford facing racial terror from white parents very publicly on their way to school. Look at Charlotte High School, 1971, a mob of angry white parents led by Mary Nicolisi, throwing rocks, hurling racial epithets, hanging effigies of Black dolls from nooses on the trees outside of the school, terrorizing Black students during the school reorganization or integration program that lasted just 1 year before these white activists were successful in getting it to end. But these white folks fought hard to keep segregation. In fact, in 1966, there was an anti-Black demonstration at Marshall with parents and students holding signs saying, Black people go home, keep Marshall clean. In fact, on the way to Marshall High School, the DNC documents how tensions developed after 3 Black girls were cut by flying glass on a bus stoned by these white protesters. James Beard, president of the Black Student Union at Charlotte High School, which was formed to keep Black students safe and demand their right for equity. There's an actual yearbook picture of them. Writes, we were on a bus, we'd get to the graveyard on Lake Ave, and they would hide in the graveyard behind the wall, throwing bricks, rocks, iron, anything they could find at the bus. They'd bust windows and people would be screaming. And yet Beard, in an interview with Justin Murphy, says that while horrific and awful of an experience, he went to Charlotte hating white people. He didn't grow up around white people. And at Charlotte, he actually made friends with white kids because not all of them were racist. And he realized, actually, I love some of these people. And he says that although it sounded crazy, he was grateful for that experience. And yet the city didn't listen to people like James Beard and disbanded that program a year later. Meanwhile, towns like Penfield were doing their own things to keep their schools segregated through something called exclusionary suburban zoning. There was a nationwide push in communities and suburbs to change their lax zoning laws to incredibly exclusive and expensive ones. According to the Yale report this summer on racial covenants and housing segregation, in that report, the authors write, towns that passed exclusionary zoning laws were regressing into a past of restrictive covenants. Even a county-sponsored Blue Ribbon Committee on Housing at the time called these laws naked notices that post-suburban land is a preserve of indifference and intolerance. Take a look at Penfield Zoning Board, 1965, an all-white board responding to calls and complaints, particularly from a lobbying group of folks over off of Scrivener Road who wanted bigger lot sizes, a ban on any kind of affordable or apartment houses being built to keep Black people out. But legally, you couldn't zone based on race anymore, but you could and still can zone and discriminate based on class. And they listened. In fact, listen to these town planning board minutes. Listen to what Walter Peters said, town board member. He said, we had 46 residents call to ask if a proposal to include affordable housing in the town's land use plan was a wedge to bring Black people into the town. Town officials, he said, was his advice, they should listen to the residents when it came to this land use plan. In fact, a housing task force appointed by Penfield's town board in 1972 admitted that racial bias may be a factor behind the town's exclusionary zoning laws that are the same zoning laws in the town of Penfield today. Flyers like this one arguing for this zoning were demanding the threat of guess who's going to move into your neighborhood. People like Robert Rhodes, though, one of the first Black people to own a home in the town of Pittsford, he fought hard against these zoning policies. In fact, describing them as racial covenants, saying enacting these zoning policies like the ones in '68 that Pittsford enacted on its land, he said, they will hasten the day when we will be a divided community on our way to self-destruction. And I don't know about you, but when I hear those words and I think about Rochester today, one of the most segregated communities in the country, number 1 or 2 for worst places in the country for Black people to live, where your life expectancy based on race can be up to 9 years based on your zip code, is marked incredibly by segregation, it leaves me feeling pretty upset. Looking at this redlining map on the left and the way it mirrors our current census data for where people live. And the same when it comes to where wealth is hoarded in our suburbs and poverty concentrated where it was designed to be in its inner city. The same when it comes to owner occupancy of homes, social vulnerability, food insecurity, asthma, uninsurance, mental health, high blood pressure. What neighborhoods are they the highest? Those red line neighborhoods, as designed. And so while this law may no longer be in effect, nothing has ever been done to remedy it. And this story really hasn't been listened to, despite people trying to tell it. I mean, people are living up to 5 years less in a green line neighborhood compared to a red line neighborhood in Rochester today. There's a wealth gap nationally of 10 times the difference between white and Black. It's going to take Black families 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth that white families have today, unless we decide to listen to people like Baldwin, Robert Rhodes, those people who are protesting in our streets in Rochester, demanding racial justice. Will we listen? Will we choose to live these words of Baldwin, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I hope you've been able to join me today and can carry on some of this hope and this courage that folks like Howard Coles had when they faced racism in the Code of Ethics or the Real Estate Board, the way racial covenants were faced and won against by Judge Davis in the 19th Ward, the way Connie Mitchell, Dr. Walter Cooper, Alice Young, the Leaves, the Biases refused to back down and fought redlining by moving into those suburban or white neighborhoods, the way thousands protested in the street against urban renewal, and the way exclusionary suburban zoning policy has been fought by people like Aaliyah Rhodes or people like Kevin Beckford today, who continue to push for justice when it comes to who is allowed to live where. And one of the things, though, that gives me the most hope, it's not just that I get the chance, I've gotten the chance to share this talk hundreds of times across Monroe County, to boards, to libraries, to churches, all across town. It's that kids in schools are given the chance to learn this story, not in a lecture form like this. I would never have this lecture be something that you give to kids. That wouldn't be my goal unless you really asked me a lot to come. What instead is most important is that kids get the chance to look at primary source documents, to see the current statistics today of where people live, the hard facts report that shows some of that disparity. And then to acknowledge, is this disparity? Is this racism? Is there a difference in our community based on where you live and what you look like? And then if so, how did we get there? Digging into that federal policy of redlining, looking at the maps and the law, and digging into what our county legislature did with covenants, what our schools did with blackface shows, and the way people of color like Connie Mitchell and Judge Davis demanded equality and fought back for change. And it's our hope that kids will see these policies, start to understand what's behind some of the problems in our community, why Penfield is #1 when it comes to its border for segregation in the country, and decide that's not the town I want to live in anymore. Maybe adults will follow the example of our students and our teachers who are starting to tell this story, to draw their own conclusions about it, and to say we need to make a change. So our amazing team at the Curriculum Project has come together to do this, and thousands of kids are learning this history. Some of them are deciding that, maybe they don't agree with what I would think, although they're not learning what I would think. They're just looking at the primary sources, and they're using critical thinking lenses that we give them to help think through it, and restorative practices to talk about it. But many of them are looking at it and saying, you know what? This is wrong. And I see how Dr. Cooper said it was wrong, and Howard Coles and Alice Young. And after learning this history, this girl here in the middle, one of my fourth graders several years back, learned about Alice Young, about her fight with racism, her being the first Black principal, and said, we don't have any Black principals in Rush-Henrietta, and there's no Black teachers in our school. That's systemic racism. We got to do what Alice Young did. Let's fight back. And so we did. We got parent permission. The girls researched it. They found we had 550 white teachers in Henrietta and 11 Black. Our 11 Black teachers was more than all the Black teachers in Webster, Penfield, Fairport, Pittsford, and Brighton combined. The girls invited themselves to lunch with the principal. They showed him their statistics, and they demanded change. They spoke to the assistant superintendent. Their research got to the school board, the superintendent, and all across town their story was told. And because of them and the leadership of our district, we formed partnerships with Black schools, historically Black universities in Atlanta. We've changed our policies to make it more effective in hiring teachers of color, so these girls have the teacher they truly deserve by the time they graduate. And if a group of 9-year-olds can learn this history, decide what it means, can look at how people in the past created change and say, that person looks like me. That person sounds like me. I can do what they did. I can make a change. And if they can change a school district and be a part of that work, imagine what kids across our county, imagine what folks like you here today could do to create racial justice in Monroe County. A few of the things that I personally think would be helpful is that we have to change our zoning laws. We have to allow for open housing in our communities. That has to change, in my opinion, in towns like Penfield. Not that I'm teaching that in the curriculum. Kids have a chance to read through some of those things. Again, this is just my personal ideas right now. I think making sure that this is taught in our schools, supporting groups like City Roots Land Trust, who are reinvesting in permanently affordable community-controlled land and redline neighborhoods like Beechwood and Plex. We can support affordable housing below 50 or 30% of the area median income, truly affordable housing, and not just affordable housing for seniors, which is what often happens when the little bits of it is built. We can support groups like the Tenant Union, who's fighting the almost 9,000 evictions that happen a year, literally forming human chains to prevent police from evicting people into the cold nights in Rochester. We can subsidize loans in redline neighborhoods, create suburban community land trusts. We can do things like reparations and advocate for a federal shift in the way these policies happen and that real change and justice is done. Not just ending the racist laws, but doing something to remedy them. And so as I close, I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, your thoughts. But first, one thing, if you'll humor me, if you'll open up your chat and just take a minute before I pause and just share something that you learned, something that surprised you, or a feeling that came up for you as you watch this presentation. And then we'll do questions. But if you wouldn't mind and you're open to it, please feel free to send it directly to me or to everybody in the chat. What's something that you learned, surprised you, or a feeling that came up? Or if there's something that you want to push back on, please pop that in there too. But before I answer any questions, I just want to give you a minute or two. I'm just going to pause, type that in the chat, and then when I say go, feel free to just hit enter. Is that okay, Peggy?
Sure, that's perfect. Thank you. That's wonderful. That's perfect.
Great. And I know some of you are going to want to hit enter right away. Don't do it. Wait until I say hit enter. So go ahead and open up your chat,
Yeah.
share something that you noticed, something you learned that surprised you,
Good.
or a feeling that came up, or any pushback that you have. And then we'll move on to questions,
Great.
other ways forward. Just take another minute.
Yeah.
So type it in, but don't hit enter.
Mhm. Okay.
Take about 10 more seconds to share your notice,
Okay.
your wonder, what came up for you.
Mhm.
If you're a slow typer, I'm very sorry. Still keep them coming. All right, go ahead and hit enter in the chat and take a look at what your neighbors and friends had to sort of say. And then we'll start to open up through some questions after we take a chance to read some of these thoughts.
Mhm.
Someone saying they were surprised by the widespread use and popularity of blackface shows. Someone sharing the fact so many parcels of land have anti-black or anti-Italian covenants. There feels like a bit of embarrassment to this. Someone feeling a little bit of shame for where they live. Someone saying, I learned a lot about Rochester. They teach social policy as they impacted Buffalo, and they really enjoyed this. That there's so few Black teachers in the suburbs. Someone feeling a little bit of guilt about this, and I hope that guilt is about moving forward, making that change. Someone else sharing, they've learned some of this in the past, but experienced it back when they moved here, when no one would rent to a person with his last name. The depth of racial segregation in Penfield, having lived here since 1974 and realizing I hadn't been involved. Someone sharing sadness and anger about this history. I really appreciate the feeling sharing too. I think it's important to acknowledge that that stuff comes up. Feeling shame, but wanting to take action. Someone saying, I've never heard the names of many of the Black folks in this presentation, but that they're grateful and glad that their kid is learning this in Henrietta. The redlining that happened in Penfield, memories in the past in East High School in 71 and 72 during reorganization. Sounds like some people lived through some of these experiences. Some people saying not realizing how prevalent this was. Someone else sharing, growing up at Wayne High School, I wasn't educated about this history in my town. I can't tell you, Wayne High School had a blackface show almost every year up through the early 60s. Someone saying we have to make this change, feeling sadness that coming out, motivation to be a part of it. Someone who taught in schools but is feeling appalled by this history. Let's see here. Yeah, some people saying there are no Black teachers in the school that I go to or that I work at. That though some of these things are illegal, they haven't really changed. And then some folks remembering the first Black kids who came to Harris Hill when urban suburban or some of the busing programs really began. I want to thank people for just like taking that moment to notice, to wonder, to share what came up for you. I think that's incredibly important. We do the same thing with kids. And I encourage you to make sure you have a conversation with friends and family about it. I'd also though love to hear people's questions. I'd love to hear people's pushback. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about how we move forward. So if anyone has a comment or a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share, I would really appreciate that as well. I just would invite people to make sure they keep it respectful and not take too much time. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you were talking about how the racial justice curriculum you're incorporating and have incorporated into your fourth grade classes, and what other districts are picking that up? Because I know that my child's is not. And I've been in touch with the principal about it, but how do we get more of that in schools?
First, you could set up a meeting with you and your principal. I would love to sit down with them and share. Right now, and when I say this, I'm not saying that these districts have signed on officially or that's fully a part of their curriculum. A number of districts have officially written it into their curriculum. A number of districts are piloting this. So when I make this list of districts right now, I hope what you're hearing me really be clear about, because I want districts should own what they're doing and make it their language. But the districts we've engaged with, where we have trained a number of teachers, include Fairport, Penfield, Webster, East and West Irondequoit. We've worked with teachers in Greece, Spencerport, Rush-Henrietta, Allendale. We've been at Harley. We've been at McQuaid, and a number of schools in RCSD and quite a few charter schools. I know there's a district or two that I'm missing in my head right now. And then there's a number of other districts that we've also been talking a little bit about, talking with, that we're going to be doing work with next year. But if you want to send an email introduction, a lot of the schools we're in Penfield because hundreds of parents sent emails to the school district and said, this is really important to us. People heard a talk like this one that I gave, or one of my colleagues at our project gave, and said, I really want my kids to know this. And the superintendent came and it was awesome. We had all the fourth grade teachers in Penfield and really excited. And we're excited to get their feedback and have them be a part of making the curriculum better and improving it. So we've trained about 450 teachers across the county, and we've got quite a few left to train and to help them, one, learn the history and learn how to talk about it. And part of our funding, we're funded by United Way, Farish, ESL, Greater Rochester Health Foundation, Paychecks, Bank of America. I mean, pretty much all the big funders in town have funded us so that for the next 3 years, we can offer free consulting for districts, professional development, and support for teachers in doing this in a way that's not didactic, that's truly inquiry-based, and helping kids learn how to talk about it. Because kids have these questions. They know racism's going on. They heard about the protest this summer. They know about the insurrection. They want to know what to think about it. But it's not the teacher's job to give them the answers. It's to give them primary sources. It's to give them critical thinking schools to interact with it, to think about it, and the framework for how to talk about it and disagree and work towards consensus and how we change. So I hope you reach out, Elizabeth. My email is in the link that I just shared in the chat, as well as the recording of the presentation and an FAQ about the curriculum. So I'd recommend take that FAQ about the curriculum, send that along with the introduction. But I'm pretty sure all the districts do know about our work, but sometimes it takes parents just saying, this is important to us. And a lot of districts have been really great in listening. I did mention a documentary that was July 64. Someone just mentioned in the chat. And if you look in the document here, oh, I didn't actually post it. Let me put that in here. Give me 1 second. July 64 is actually free online. It's a 50-minute documentary about the Uprising of July 1964. I just put it in the chat, but I'm also going to put it right here in the document that I shared. If anyone else has a question, feel free to please unmute for a comment.
Okay, great.
There is a list of the books that I mentioned. It's also in the link that I shared in the chat. So I hope that helps, Jeanette.
I have a question. Yes,
Oh, please
I have
go
a
ahead.
question. Yes,
Yeah.
I did send it via chat, but maybe it wasn't noticed.
I missed it. I'm sorry, Carolyn.
You were talking about a red line district, and on the map, it was shown as red areas, correct?
Correct. Yep.
It seems to me, though, that at the same time you're saying that, that is the only area where Blacks were allowed to buy houses or to live. Is that correct?
That is correct. So green line technically.
So that was really a non-red line district.
Hold on. So I think I know it. I think I know what the confusion is. So give me 1 second to share the screen here.
Yep.
All right. Can you see the map there?
Yes, thank you.
So when you look at the map on the left, red meant hazardous. So it meant the government would not subsidize any type of mortgage or home repair in a red neighborhood. It also
Okay,
meant that Black people would be steered into those neighborhoods. But already the real estate board had steered people into those neighborhoods to begin with, starting in the early 1900s with the Great Migration. Green and blue meant they were the most likely neighborhoods for the federal government to subsidize mortgages and to give subsidies to builders and developers, including all of the suburbs. And so that meant whites only. In the 1970s, advocates like Metro Act, which actually sued the town of Penfield all the way to the Supreme Court in 1975 in Worth v. Selden. They lost, but it was about Penfield's discriminatory zoning policy. And they lost on a technicality, which is important. But what's interesting about that is they started a campaign called Greenlining. And you'll see in the Raise Commission, my friends and I at the Tenant Union and the City Roots Land Trust, we really fought hard for this city-county commission to include something called Greenlining, which for us, we're talking about instead of investing or disinvesting in red line neighborhoods, like we largely still do, let's greenline them, meaning we're gonna invest in those neighborhoods and we're gonna reallocate resources. So that, I hope that, does that help with the confusion there, Carolyn?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I'd also recommend that you take a quick peek in the document that I shared here. You'll see there's a video called Segregated by Design. It's a 15-minute video by Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, and it lays out redlining 1,000 times more clearly than I ever could. Rothstein is incredible. And if you're a reader, The Color of Law, I can't recommend that book enough. And I know Penfield Library has it.
Right, we do. Yeah.
Thank you, Peggy. I
Great.
took a risk there, but I figured. Anybody else have a question or a comment?
There was that question about Whitehaven Cemetery. What is behind the name, and does it or did it have a restrictive covenant? I thought you might have addressed that at one time in another presentation, or
No, I don't know about Whitehaven Cemetery. I couldn't
thought
tell
that
you.
came up. But
There's a lot of reasons for that. Now, there is a book called Sundown Towns by Professor
Okay.
James Lowen, which is about whites only towns in America, and naming was often a part of those signaling, where Whitehaven Cemetery could have meant, and cemeteries named like that did mean in other places whites only. I don't have the evidence or documentation about that in Penfield.
Okay.
You know if that is true or not. Although it would be interesting to go through the name on the registry, or what, I don't know what it's called, that lists the folks who are there, buried there, and see what was the actual practice.
We'll have to look that up. Okay. In your list of books, someone had asked, but you just published that right here, I think.
Yep, that's right there in the
List of
chat.
books. You had that in the chat, right?
A bunch of folks, I can put it in there one more time. There's that link.
And the chat will be saved in the recording too, so people can see that after. It's probably will be about a week before it'll be up. But
Someone else said, Christopher asked, what can be done to help change zoning laws in Penfield? Well, one of the things I would first do is take a look and read your zoning laws. Take a look at them. I would also read Connor Dwyer Reynolds. He is a professor at Yale Law School. Now he is the director of the Police Accountability Board in Rochester. He's a good friend of mine. He's a Penfield alumni, went to Penfield High School, and he's done amazing research on zoning in Penfield. And he, I think, I'm almost 100% positive it is linked in here. Oh, maybe it's not. Nope, I will link his article in just a second. It's about 70 pages on the zoning history of Penfield, but it lays out what happened and how. And really, though, the big thing that I recommend with changing these zoning policies, it's the technicians that adjust the zoning, but you have to build the political will to do these kinds of things. And right now, you guys saw what happened in Pittsford when Kevin Beckford just asked for a very small amount of not even very affordable housing to be built. People lost their minds. Not about racism, though. This is a town of a certain character, right? And Kevin, like Leo Rhodes before him, or Robert Rhodes before him, he called it out. And so I think we have to have the courage to sort of name that, but know the facts before we go and do it. Obviously, hearing a short presentation from me is not enough probably to arm yourself, but build that coalition and start to advocate for it. I think that's big. Ask your zoning board members what's going on with that, or ask your town board members. But a big thing is towns like Penfield do PUD zoning, or place-based development, or like each lot, like if you wanted to build apartments in Penfield, you'd have to get a special PUD thing done. I'm not a zoning, I'm a fourth grade teacher, guys. You're asking the wrong guy, but I do know some about it. Right now, it's like case by case. So developers like, Cornerstone that builds affordable housing, or Conifer that might want to build affordable housing in a town like Penfield, they'd have to do tons and tons of work to apply through the town board to have the right to do it. And it's been almost impossible. A bunch of the developers I've talked to who've tried to do that in Penfield or Webster, it hasn't happened. So what we would advocate is that actually the zoning policy gets rewritten in towns to be not the zoning policy written in the 70s, but updated to truly be open. There's a group called Desegregate Connecticut that is incredible. Sarah Bonin came to Rochester just a couple of months ago with a community design center and did an amazing presentation called Desegregate Connecticut about the work they're doing to change zoning in Hartford, Connecticut. And one of the things that is like low-hanging fruit is something called an ADU, where if people allowed it so that your garage or your basement or even like your in-law house, kind of, an in-law home, I'm talking about, could be allowed to be rented as an ADU. And I can't remember what ADU means, but essentially it's like a grandma pad is sometimes what they call them. But even allowing that kind of a thing in your zoning would allow for lots of folks to be able to move out and make some remedy to that affordability. Another thing would be community land trusts, where the community could come together to buy up properties, maybe not in one place, but probably scattered about the community. And in the deeds, there's something called a ground lease that would make those homes permanently affordable. So people could buy them, first-time Black home buyers could buy those homes at a subsidy, just like my family did for being white in the 50s. And then when they sell their home, they have to sell it to someone who also meets the income requirements, so lower income family, and that subsidy gets passed along. They can build equity, sell it for a little more, but they can't profit off it in the same way that if they could sell it at full market rate. And that's been a really effective tool, both here in Rochester, Albany, Burlington, Vermont. The Dudley Street neighborhood in Boston has done amazing work with community land trusts. I know I've talked with a bunch of folks in Brighton about doing that. I think there's some real opportunity there. But I also think federal policy has to change and holding our elected officials accountable for enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And I think reinventing it is going to be huge in allowing this kind of thing to happen. And yes, I did share that Rothstein video URL, but I can share it just by itself too, so that you don't miss it. So there it is. Trying to think what else. Someone shares Eyes on the Prize is airing on PBS this month. Awesome documentary. Can't recommend that enough. Anybody else have questions, comments, pushback, something that's really getting them angry, or something that we can do to move forward?
For the recording, let's see, it will be, okay. Just check here.
I think the library is going to put the recording
Yeah, I'm
online.
just gonna,
That I shared in the chat and that Google Doc.
in about a week, I think.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone for having me, especially the library and Peggy.
Well, thank you so much, Shane.
To share with you all. My email is in that document. I'd love to hear your thoughts or anything else that's going on. Elizabeth, looking forward to hearing from you and anybody else. And best of luck. And I hope that we start making some change and facing this history head on. I hope you have some good conversation with friends and family in the coming weeks about some of this. And I also hope that you're left feeling some hope. Despite the tragedy, despite the injustice, people have always fought back. They're continuing to, and we can come together to continue to do it. So you all coming tonight gives me hope. I hope you have a great evening. Talk to everybody soon.
Thank you very much, Shane. Thank you, everyone. It was a fascinating presentation.